The scorching desert sun beat down on June 24, 1941, as Allied mechanics faced a troubling discovery somewhere behind British lines in the Western Desert. The armor was supposed to work. It was built specifically to stop bullets. That was the entire reason it existed. Then they fired. Standard rifles cracked out across the test range, and the rounds tore straight through the sides of a captured German armored car as if the steel wasn't even there. 8 millimeters of sloped steel, the kind German propaganda had promised would shield crews from enemy fire, proved utterly useless against armor-piercing rifle ammunition. The SDKFZ 222, the workhorse of German light reconnaissance, carried a flaw that would terrify every Allied soldier who encountered it. Visually, the machine looked genuinely formidable. The angular plating formed that unmistakable diamond shape. A 20mm autocannon jutted from the open-topped turret, bristling with purpose. It could race across the desert floor at 80 kilometers per hour, appearing and vanishing faster than most vehicles could even respond. The crews who crewed them had total faith in these machines. They'd been assured the protection would keep them alive. What nobody had told them was this: British infantrymen carrying Lee Enfield rifles loaded with armor-piercing rounds could kill them from over 150 meters away. But the story of the 222 doesn't begin with failure. It begins with how Germany ended up building it in the first place. After the Treaty of Versailles strangled Germany's military ambitions, tank production became completely forbidden. Armored cars, though, existed in a strange grey zone within the treaty's wording. The Reichswehr discovered this loophole and pushed it wide open. Since tanks were off-limits, why not build armored cars that could do everything tanks did? Scout ahead, gather intelligence, screen flanks, hit enemy positions. The planning dragged through the mid-1930s as German military designers hammered out what they actually needed. They wanted something fast and nimble that could race ahead of advancing columns, watch for enemy movements, survive meetings with infantry, and escape when heavier weapons appeared. Protection took a back seat to speed. Mobility mattered most. German thinking at the time assumed reconnaissance crews would keep their distance, staying far enough away to observe and report without getting dragged into actual firefights. The 222 emerged from this blueprint. Perched on a modified Horch 801 chassis with genuine four-wheel drive and four-wheel steering, it represented genuinely clever engineering for the era. The four-wheel steering could turn impossibly tight circles, invaluable when threading through narrow European streets or needing to reverse fast when bullets started flying. The manuals warned drivers, though, use the four-wheel steering only below 20 kilometers per hour, or the whole thing gets unstable at higher speeds. When production started in 1937, the vehicle looked strikingly modern. Those angular plates weren't just for show. German designers deliberately sloped them because angled armor could make bullets bounce off instead of punching through. The 10-sided turret sat open to the air, protected by wire mesh screens meant to catch hand grenades, giving the crew good sightlines while keeping weight reasonable. The weapons changed as production rolled forward. Early vehicles carried the 20mm autocannon paired with a 7.9mm machine gun. Those initial runs used the MG-13 before switching to the far superior MG-34 in 1938, which stayed standard for most of the war. By 1942, they swapped to a faster-firing 37mm cannon with better punch against light armor and aircraft. 3 crew members crammed into impossibly tight spaces. The driver hunched in the front hull, peering through a narrow observation port. The commander and gunner squeezed together in that turret, scarcely roomier than a car's interior today. Still, the crews didn't complain much. The vehicle ran reliably, and it moved beautifully. The Horch V8 engine came in either 3.5-litre or 3.8-litre versions, depending on which model you were looking at, offering decent power for the job. The 3.5-litre engine in early variants pushed 75 horsepower, while the later 3.8-litre engine managed 90 horsepower. But here's where it all fell apart: the armor itself. The 1938 vehicles carried just 8 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel everywhere: front, sides, top, bottom. Imagine 4 credit cards stacked together. That's your protection. That thickness stopped pistol bullets, submachine gun bursts, and shrapnel from faraway explosions. Angled shots at distance might bounce off, but armor-piercing rifle rounds fired straight on at close range punched right through like it was paper. German engineers realized this wasn't enough. Starting in 1939, they began adding more steel to the front, 14.5 millimeters. Better against rifles coming at you head-on, though the sides stayed thin. The later variants introduced after 1942 got 30 millimeters up front, a real improvement. Except thousands of earlier machines with minimal protection stayed in service, and even the newer ones kept that vulnerable 8mm side armor. The undersides and rear were barely 5mm, good for shrapnel, useless against anything else. German planners had made a deliberate choice. Speed and mobility would compensate. Reconnaissance crews wouldn't get close enough to need heavy protection. That's what they believed anyway. The propaganda machine had worked perfectly. Official materials showed sloped armor deflecting shells like magic. Training films showed crews exactly what they wanted to see. Soldiers needed to believe their vehicles would keep them alive, or they wouldn't push forward into danger. The angular design looked impressive, modern. The mesh over the turret suggested real engineering thought. German crews trusted their equipment because they'd been trained to have faith in it. Reality arrived slowly as the war wore on. In Poland, September 1939, the 222 had performed beautifully. Polish forces, caught unprepared with ancient weapons, couldn't stand against German reconnaissance units. Polish anti-tank rifles were scarce, and infantry had almost no armor-piercing ammunition. The fast German cars raced across Poland, gathered intelligence, and created panic in rear areas. The success fed confidence. France in May 1940 told the same story. Despite heavier tanks and more artillery, French forces got outmaneuvered by German combined arms tactics. The 222 excelled in rapid advance, screening panzer divisions and exploiting breakthroughs. French infantry, disorganized and retreating, offered little resistance to fast reconnaissance vehicles. 6 weeks and the campaign ended. German crews came home convinced their vehicles were combat-proven winners. Officers claimed it proved German technology beat anything Western democracies had built. The Balkans in April 1941 seemed to confirm it. Yugoslav and Greek forces, equipped with weapons from the previous war, couldn't effectively counter modern German armor. Mountains favored lighter, nimble vehicles over heavy tanks. The 222 worked well in these secondary theaters against weaker opposition. By spring 1941, reconnaissance crews had fought 3 successful campaigns where their vehicles had proven effective. Nobody questioned whether protection was adequate. Then Africa changed everything. The Africa Corps arrived in Libya in February 1941. The formation had been officially established on January 11, 1941, when German High Command reacted to Italian military collapse in North Africa. Erwin Rommel, the commander who'd made his reputation leading the 7th Panzer Division during the France invasion, received command on February 11th. First German troops of the 5th Light Division reached Tripoli on February 11th, 1941. Advanced reconnaissance elements came too, units that would become the eyes and ears of operations. The Reconnaissance Battalion reached Tripoli on February 14th, equipped with 222 armored cars and other vehicles, immediately pushing into desert to probe British positions and learn enemy strength. The 5th Light Division later got redesignated as the 21st Panzer Division on August 15, 1941, showing how operations were expanding. The desert presented challenges nothing in European experience had prepared them for. Emptiness stretched for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. Almost nowhere to hide. Temperatures climbed above 50 degrees Celsius by day, then nearly froze at night. That sand got into everything. Mechanisms wore down, filters clogged, engines choked. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of kilometers across completely empty country, with zero infrastructure. Getting fuel and water forward became a constant nightmare. For vehicles like the 222, the desert offered both gifts and curses. Open ground let the speed work properly. You could see enemy forces from kilometers away. Firm sand and gravel gave good traction for the 4-wheel drive, but that openness meant nowhere to disappear. Vast distances burned fuel faster than the small tanks carried, forcing crews to plan every mission carefully and place refueling stops strategically. The 222 performed well initially during those early Africa Corps deployments. British forces, surprised by German aggression and speed, kept getting outmaneuvered. German reconnaissance units penetrated deep into British rear areas, finding supply dumps, headquarters, and troop movements. The 222's speed made perfect sense for these quick jabs. Race in at high speed, observe from distance, get out before British forces organized anything effective. The reconnaissance battalion attached to the 21st Panzer Division stayed active throughout 1941 and 1942, running missions from simple route reconnaissance to aggressive raids on British facilities. Photographs from fall 1941 show 222s with the 21st Panzer Division in Libya, angular profiles sharp against the desert horizon as they raced across sand and gravel. British forces had been fighting desert warfare since Italy entered in June 1940. They'd developed tactics and hard-won experience Germans initially lacked. More importantly, British forces carried modern weapons, rifles with armor-piercing ammunition. The Western Desert was about to become a brutal classroom, and the 222 would fail its test. German vehicles started getting captured almost immediately. Desert warfare's fluid nature, rapid advances and retreats across huge territories, meant damaged or fuel-starved machines got left behind frequently. The first major haul came during Operation Crusader in November 1941. The offensive began November 18th with the goal of relieving Tobruk's besieged garrison. Confused tank battles erupted around the city as British and German forces clashed in swirling desert engagements. By November 27th, British forces relieved Tobruk. By mid-December, Rommel had withdrawn to El Agheila. Battlefields after those fights scattered with dozens of German vehicles, some knocked out by anti-tank fire, others empty of fuel, still others abandoned when units retreated. British recovery teams moved systematically across the wasteland, collecting everything salvageable. Several 222s ended up in their hands in various conditions. Standard procedure meant captured enemy equipment got shipped to the School of Tank Technology at Chertsey in Surrey for thorough evaluation. This facility on Chobham Lane in rural Surrey served as Britain's primary centre for analysing captured Axis vehicles throughout World War II. The school was part of the Military College of Science and would later become the Fighting Vehicles Proving Establishment. Teams from the Royal Tank Regiment and other units conducted detailed technical analysis of every captured machine, producing comprehensive reports on capabilities, weaknesses, and tactical meaning. Field commanders, though, needed answers immediately. They couldn't wait months for reports from England. What weapons could actually kill these German cars? Mechanics and engineers working with the 8th Army faced a crucial question. What made these captured German vehicles tick? And more importantly, how could British forces stop them? The answer lay in pulling damaged machines away from the fighting, stripping them down, and understanding every bolt and circuit. This hands-on approach became the backbone of British intelligence gathering as the war dragged on. Every captured tank, every disabled armoured car, every knocked-out reconnaissance vehicle told a story worth hearing. The jewel in this collection was Tiger 131. British forces seized this German heavy tank during operations near Hill 187, also known as Jebel Jaffa, in Tunisia during April 1943. A British 6-pounder anti-tank gun had punched into its side and jammed the turret solid, forcing the crew to bail out and leave their steel fortress behind. What happened next changed how the British understood German armour technology. The tank was hauled back to safe ground, where engineers fell upon it like archaeologists at a dig site, measuring, testing, dissecting every system. After months of this careful examination in Tunisia, the vehicle made the long journey to England, where it arrived at Chertsey for the most exhaustive analysis imaginable. Nothing escaped scrutiny. The composition and thickness of the armour plating, the tolerances and performance of the weapon systems, how the engine breathed and responded, every gear in the transmission, every technical detail that could possibly matter. The intelligence extracted from this single captured machine filtered directly into how Britain designed its own tanks and planned its anti-tank defenses. Light reconnaissance vehicles like the SDKFZ 222 generated less excitement than heavy tanks, but the British took nothing for granted. Throughout the war, multiple examples of the German four-wheel drive scout car were recovered and shipped back to Britain for the same methodical treatment. Each one added another layer to the intelligence picture, another piece of the puzzle. Even vehicles of modest tactical importance received this comprehensive technical evaluation because the British understood that small details could save lives. The first revelation came as a shock. The Horch 8 engine was a work of art. Cast with almost surgical precision, machined with the care of a master craftsman, it ran smoothly even after months of desert combat had battered the vehicle. The four-wheel drive system turned with surprising elegance despite the punishment of sand and rock. Turning the wheel didn't just swivel the front end like a conventional car, all four wheels could pivot, allowing the machine to maneuver through spaces that seemed impossible. From the quality of every weld to the fit of every component, German manufacturing spoke of an industrial base that knew what it was doing. These machines weren't thrown together, they were built by people who understood precision. Then came the armor measurements, calipers emerged, and the engineers began their systematic recording. 8 millimeters on the sides, 5 millimeters on the bottom and rear deck. Thin. Incredibly thin when you considered what this vehicle was supposed to be protected against. Even factoring in the angled plates, which made the steel thicker in effect by forcing projectiles to travel further through it, the numbers troubled the British technicians. One sergeant, a man who'd worked the metal on civilian automobiles in Birmingham before the war, shook his head. He'd shaped car body panels thicker than this. It seemed almost impossible that such a light skin was meant to stop military weapons. Someone made a suggestion that turned into an experiment. Why not fire at the vehicle and see what actually penetrated? They started simple. Webley revolvers came out and soldiers fired 9mm rounds at the hull. The bullets punched away into the desert with a sound like coins on glass. The armor was doing exactly what it should, stopping pistol fire cold. They escalated. Sten guns appeared. The same submachine guns infantry carried, firing 9mm rounds in quick succession. Most bounced away, but the perpendicular hits that connected dead-on did something interesting. They didn't penetrate, but they severely dimpled the metal, and on the inside surface, Spaulding kicked up sharp fragments that would have torn into anyone inside. Against pistols and submachine guns, the armor worked. Then someone brought up a Lee Enfield. This was the British infantryman's rifle, chambers in 303 British. A full-power cartridge that sent a 174-grain bullet downrange at about 2,440 feet per second. It was never meant to punch through armor. It was designed to put riflemen in the fight at ranges up to 600 meters. But the British had something else. They had armor-piercing ammunition. The W Mark I round used a hardened steel core, smaller at 93 grains, but traveling faster at around 2,500 feet per second. These rounds had been developed for exactly this purpose. The test standard said that at least 60% of such rounds must penetrate 8mm of steel at 175 yards. A former competitive shooter among the mechanics took the rifle. From 50 yards out, he aimed at a flat section of the hull side where the armor faced straight toward him, no angle to help the steel do its job. He squeezed the trigger. The armor-piercing round didn't bounce. It punched through clean. The entry hole was neat and round on the outside. The exit hole told the real story, jagged and larger, metal peeled back in sharp fragments from the impact's violence. The mechanics crowded around, running fingers over the bullet hole, measuring it, discussing what it meant. More rounds came out. Different angles, different distances. Under 100 yards with straight hits. The W Mark I kept penetrating that 8mm side armor. At longer ranges, or when the bullets hit at an angle, success became less certain, but in the chaos of actual combat, a British infantryman with armor-piercing ammunition could stop this vehicle. The crew inside wouldn't even know what hit them until the rounds were already tearing through. The implications rippled through the 8th Army. Intelligence officers drew up reports and distributed them to every tank crew and infantry unit that might encounter these vehicles. Tank crews learned they couldn't rely on their tanks to stop the German scout cars. Infantry could handle them. Infantry units got new tactical guidance. Soldiers carrying rifles loaded with armor-piercing ammunition didn't need to wait for tank support or call in anti-tank guns. If a SDKFZ 222 appeared, a rifleman with the right ammunition could engage it effectively and likely disable it. The psychological shift was profound. These weren't armored fortresses anymore. They were vulnerable. Further testing opened more doors. The boy's anti-tank rifle, a massive 55 caliber weapon firing 13.9 mm rounds, delivered 23.2 mm of penetration at 100 yards. Against the thin-skinned German scout car, it was massive overkill, but it confirmed that British anti-tank rifles would absolutely devastate these vehicles. The 2-pounder anti-tank gun, the main British anti-tank weapon throughout most of the Desert Campaign, could penetrate the 222's armor at any practical fighting distance. Even tank crews learned something interesting. Their coaxial machine guns, the 7.92 mm weapons mounted beside the main turret, could punch through the armor at close range if they focused fire on one spot. The knowledge spread like ripples in water. Commonwealth forces from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India received the same intelligence briefings. Free French units learned about the vulnerability. As the war expanded and more Allied nations joined the fighting, the information multiplied across the theaters. German reconnaissance vehicles were no longer mysterious threats. Among Allied infantry, word spread that the SDKFZ 222's thin armor made it a legitimate target for any rifleman with armor-piercing ammunition. The way soldiers approached these vehicles transformed. Soviet forces discovered these truths independently through their own hard learning. On August 23, 1941, the Red Army captured a SDKFZ 221, the smaller predecessor to the 222, near Moscow and put it on display. By September 7th, they'd transferred a captured 222 to the gas factory at Gorky for detailed examination. Vitaly Grashev, chief designer for GAZ, and his team measured every dimension, tested every material, studied every design choice. Grashev found himself particularly fascinated by the faceted armor plates, all angled to create ricochet surfaces that would deflect incoming fire. Soviet engineers had already started work on their own light armored car back on July 17, 1941. But seeing the German vehicle made them sharpen their thinking about what they wanted to build. The result was the BA-64, which rolled into production by April 1942. The hull shape borrowed heavily from the German design, and the Soviets copied the multifaceted angled armor plate arrangement directly. But Soviet engineers learned from German errors. They added 9 mm of side armor instead of 8, a small improvement that still wouldn't stop armor-piercing rifle fire, but every millimeter mattered. More fundamentally, they accepted what German designers had tried to deny. Light armored cars simply couldn't compete with modern anti-tank weapons. Soviet engineers designed around this limitation rather than against it. They built smaller and simpler. The BA-64 carried only a 2-person crew instead of 3. It weighed 2.4 tons compared to the German vehicle's 4.8. Production costs dropped significantly because they used existing truck and car components from Soviet factories. Those same parts already had tooling, already had proven supply chains. The GAZ factory at Gorky could build BA-64s on the same assembly lines that made GAZ-64 Jeeps. Sharing components accelerated production in ways German precision manufacturing never could. Between 1942 and 1946, the Soviets built approximately 9,110 BA-64 variants. That included 3,991 original models from 1942 to 1943, then 5,209 improved BA-64B models from 1943 to 1946. The Germans built fewer than 1,000 SDKFZ Tu-22s across 6 years of production. Soviet vehicles remained in Soviet service into the early 1950s, while German reconnaissance cars had already become obsolete relics. After the war, the Soviets exported BA-64s to Poland, Czechoslovakia, China, North Korea, and Yugoslavia. They saw combat across multiple post-war conflicts. The German design inspired something better suited to Soviet capabilities and philosophy: mass production of adequate vehicles instead of limited production of sophisticated ones. British forces developed their own response with the Daimler and Humber armoured cars. Both offered substantially better armour protection than anything the Germans produced for reconnaissance. The Daimler, entering service in 1941, carried 16 millimeters of armour on the hull sides and 30 millimeters on the front. This wasn't theoretical protection. It actually stopped rifle fire, including armour-piercing ammunition, at realistic combat distances. The Daimler mounted a 2-pounder anti-tank gun, making it genuinely dangerous against enemy vehicles rather than just armed with a 20mm autocannon like the German Scout car. Different nations had different answers to the same problem. Germany chose speed and agility over protection. Britain chose firepower and proper armour, accepting a bit less mobility. The Soviet Union chose mass production and economy, accepting trade-offs in both protection and complexity. In armoured cars operating in contested territory, British experience suggested their approach worked best. Soviet mass production was brilliant for getting adequate numbers into units that desperately needed them. Soviet vehicles got the job done at a fraction of German cost. American forces arriving in North Africa during late 1942 started their own testing program. Ordnance teams brought scientific discipline to the work, running systematic ballistics tests and compiling detailed technical reports. They wanted Americans facing these vehicles for the first time in Tunisia to have the intelligence they needed. The M1903 Springfield rifle, a bolt-action design from the First World War that still served alongside the newer M1 Garand, fired the 30-06 cartridge. The M2 armor-piercing round, identified by its black bullet tip, had been developed specifically to defeat light armor. Official specifications demanded at least 10.67 millimeters of penetration at 100 yards. Field testing showed it actually managed 12.7 millimeters at 100 yards, well above what was needed against 8mm armor. The M1 Garand, the semi-automatic rifle that gave American infantry a faster rate of fire than any other major power, fired the same 30-06 ammunition with identical armor-piercing performance. American riflemen could engage German scout cars with confidence using M2 armor-piercing ammunition and expect success. American testing covered everything: Thompson submachine guns firing the relatively weak 45 ACP pistol cartridge couldn't penetrate German armor except at point-blank range with multiple hits concentrated on one spot. The M1 carbine, firing an intermediate 30 caliber round, had marginal capability at best. Under 50 yards, it might penetrate the thinnest rear armor, but reliability was questionable. 8 millimeters of steel was just enough to turn this carbine into a nuisance rather than a threat. But against full-power rifle ammunition loaded with armor-piercing bullets, the German vehicle was vulnerable. The critical factor was ammunition type. Standard rifle rounds with lead cores couldn't penetrate 8 millimeters of steel reliably at practical combat ranges. The armor did exactly what German engineers intended, but armor-piercing ammunition with hardened steel cores had been specifically developed to defeat light armor. British, American, and Soviet forces all possessed and issued this ammunition to infantry units expected to encounter vehicles like the SDKFZ 222. Distribution patterns varied by unit and situation. Not every soldier carried armor-piercing ammunition as daily issue. However, units operating where German reconnaissance vehicles might appear received allocations. Squad leaders and designated marksmen typically carried these rounds. Anti-tank teams definitely had them. When intelligence suggested German scout cars were active in an area, additional armor-piercing rounds got handed out. The margin between success and failure came down to angle. The SDKFZ 222's designers had angled everything deliberately, maximizing ricochet potential and increasing effective thickness. A bullet striking at 60 degrees from straight on had to travel through substantially more steel than the nominal 8 millimeters. This was why German engineers sloped the plates. At extreme angles, even armor-piercing ammunition might skip off the surface. But in real combat situations, armored cars frequently offered perpendicular or near-perpendicular surfaces to enemy fire. when a vehicle moved sideways parallel to enemy positions or turned to engage targets. Those flat sides with their 8 millimeters of armor became vulnerable. The flat rear deck was even worse. These were the moments when infantry with the right ammunition could stop these machines. Tank crews operating German vehicles quickly learned they needed to keep their flanks and rear protected at all costs. During a firefight, exposing those vulnerable areas meant almost certain destruction. Yet in the chaos of actual combat, maintaining perfect defensive positioning proved nearly impossible. By the latter months of 1942, the reality had become unmistakable. The SDKFZ 222 was proving dangerously exposed across every combat zone where it operated. Whether German reconnaissance units were working in North Africa's endless desert, navigating Russia's brutal landscape, fighting through Italy's mountains, or eventually advancing into France, they encountered the same harsh truth. Enemy soldiers armed with armor-piercing ammunition could bring down their vehicles. Standard rifle rounds, when loaded with the right ammunition, punched straight through the thin steel. The writing was becoming impossible to ignore. This reconnaissance key, which had performed admirably in Poland, France, and the Balkans, where roads were better and opposition weaker, was rapidly becoming obsolete. Back in those earlier campaigns, its vulnerabilities had stayed hidden. Good roads, shorter distances, and less capable enemies had masked serious problems. Now, facing well-supplied Soviet and Allied forces with modern anti-armor weaponry, those problems were killing crews with terrifying regularity. The armor that had seemed adequate in 1938, when the military technology of that era was simpler and less lethal, had transformed into a death trap by 1943, as armor-piercing ammunition became standard issue in every Allied arsenal. German military commanders grasped the severity of the problem early in 1942. Reports flowing in from combat zones in Africa and Russia painted the same grim picture. Vehicle after vehicle was being lost to weapons that, theoretically, shouldn't have been able to defeat its protection. Officers in the field submitted urgent requests for better protected reconnaissance vehicles that could actually survive enemy fire. Those requests gained traction because crew reports contained specific, documented incidents of disaster. Vehicles were being destroyed by rifle fire and light weapons that military planners had dismissed as ineffective. The response came in the form of the SDKFZ 234 series, known as the Puma. This 8-wheeled armored car represented what German reconnaissance doctrine should have demanded from the very beginning. The Puma's armor proved genuinely protective. 30 millimeters of steel protected the front, with 14.5 millimeters covering the sides and rear. Finally, German crews had real defense against rifle fire and armor-piercing ammunition. The armor wasn't arranged flat either. Engineers incorporated sloped surfaces that dramatically increased resistance by deflecting incoming rounds. The overall protection could withstand most infantry weapons and even some light anti-tank guns. Mounted on this chassis was a 50mm cannon, the same devastating weapon mounted on later versions of the Panzer III medium tank. Suddenly, German reconnaissance units possessed genuine anti-tank capability for the first time. They could actually defend themselves and contribute to battles rather than simply observing. The 8-wheeled design meant genuine cross-country ability. The vehicle could reach 85 kilometers per hour on proper roads while maintaining reasonable speed across rough, broken terrain. The crew of 4 operated in conditions far superior to the cramped quarters of the 3-person SDKFZ 222. Visibility was better, comfort improved, and most importantly, they had a fighting chance when contact occurred. But superior design couldn't overcome German industrial reality. Development stretched longer than planned, and factory production moved slowly. The first Pumas didn't reach frontline units until late 1943. By that point, Germany was fighting desperately on multiple fronts, with resources stretched impossibly thin. The numbers tell the devastating story. Only slightly more than 100 Pumas had rolled off production lines by the end of 1943. Production continued grinding on throughout 1944, eventually reaching approximately 400 total vehicles before the assembly lines shut down in September 1944. Allied bombing campaigns and critical raw material shortages had crippled German industry's capacity to manufacture anything. 400 vehicles simply could not replace the hundreds of SDKFZ 222s still scattered across multiple theaters. 400 vehicles couldn't possibly satisfy the reconnaissance needs of dozens of German divisions stretched across 3 continents. Despite being an excellent design that finally achieved the right balance between protection, mobility, and firepower, the Puma appeared too rarely and too late. Meanwhile, the less capable but far more numerous SDKFZ 222 remained in frontline service because nothing else existed to replace it. Production of the SDKFZ 222 itself concluded in late 1943 after approximately 990 vehicles had been manufactured spanning from 1937 through 1943. The production run encompassed multiple variants reflecting evolving requirements. The earliest models from 1937 and 1938 represented the baseline. 8 mm of armor surrounded the entire vehicle, and the engine was a modest 3.5-liter unit, producing 75 horsepower. By 1939, designers implemented a mid-production improvement. Frontal armor increased to 14.5 mm, while side armor remained at the original 8 mm. This modification showed growing awareness that the vehicle needed enhanced protection, particularly facing forward where it would most often encounter enemy fire during approach or retreat. However, cost considerations and weight concerns prevented upgrading the entire hull. That fundamental vulnerability persisted. The Ausbau variant arriving in 1942 brought the most comprehensive overhaul. 30 mm of frontal armor finally provided genuine protection against rifle fire from the forward arc. Engineers fitted the more powerful 3 and 8-liter engine, producing 90 horsepower, to compensate for the additional weight. The faster-firing 38 autocannon replaced the earlier 30 mm gun, offering superior performance against aircraft and lightly armored targets. These improvements arrived too late for most vehicles already operating with units, and even the Ausbau retained that vulnerable 8 mm side armor, easily defeated by armor-piercing ammunition. Related variants within the 222 family included the SDKFZ 221, a smaller 3-person vehicle sharing identical armor problems. The SDKFZ 223 served as the radio-equipped command variant, carrying additional radio equipment but protecting that equipment with the same inadequate armor. The SDKFZ 260 and 261 represented further specialized command configurations. All variants shared one critical weakness. None possessed adequate protection for the sides and rear. As Germany's tactical situation deteriorated, many 222s found themselves relegated to rear area duties. Convoy escort, anti-partisan operations, and training roles became their reality. In these secondary assignments, the opposition rarely carried heavy weapons or possessed adequate supplies of armor-piercing ammunition. In this context, the vehicle's speed, mechanical reliability, and firepower remained valuable assets. The 20 mm cannon was lethal against unarmored vehicles and effectively suppressed infantry. Against partisans equipped only with bolt-action rifles and limited ammunition supplies, 8 mm of armor could still provide reasonable survival odds. Some vehicles endured all the way until May 1945, though by that final year they represented museum pieces rather than combat-effective equipment. The sweeping advances of Allied forces in Western Europe and Soviet armies in the East during 1944 and 1945 overwhelmed whatever defensive capabilities Germany could field. Reconnaissance vehicles, regardless of design excellence, exercised minimal impact on the war's final outcome. The actual decisions were being made by tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The overwhelming industrial production of the Allied powers made victory inevitable. What distinguished the SDKFZ 222 historically wasn't its combat performance. Rather, it revealed fundamental truths about military design compromises and how battlefield technology evolves. The vehicle excelled at nearly everything except the single factor that mattered most for crew survival. It was genuinely quick, approaching 80 kilometers per hour on good roads while maintaining respectful speed even across difficult terrain. The mechanical components proved reliable when operators maintained them properly. The Hochentchen engine delivered solid performance under demanding conditions. Visibility for the crew was outstanding, absolutely critical for reconnaissance missions. The commander enjoyed excellent sight lines from the open-top turret, though that same opening created vulnerability to overhead threats like hand grenades and artillery airbursts. German crews praised the handling characteristics. Four-wheel steering enabled tight maneuvers and rapid repositioning when situations demanded quick movement. The acceleration was sharp, allowing rapid escapes from danger. The weapons were effective for its intended purpose. The 20mm autocannon, whether the Quack 30 or the later Quack K38 variant, could devastate unarmored vehicles and pose genuine danger even to light tanks at close quarters. The rate of fire allowed sustained suppression of enemy positions. The coaxial machine gun proved excellent for engaging infantry and could be operated independently from the main gun. Ammunition storage, limited by the small vehicle's confined space, proved adequate for typical reconnaissance missions. Had the designers equipped the vehicle with just 12 or 15 millimeters of side armor instead of 8, survivability would have improved substantially against rifle fire, while remaining light enough to preserve mobility advantages. The additional weight would have been manageable. Performance would have suffered only modestly, but such an upgrade would have pushed the vehicle into a different weight class entirely, requiring a more powerful engine, stronger suspension components, and ultimately driving up costs and manufacturing complexity. Suddenly, the elegant solution became a complicated, expensive project. This represents the fundamental tension in armored vehicle engineering. Every kilogram of armor increases cost, reduces speed, boosts fuel consumption, demands a stronger engine, and multiplies maintenance requirements. Designers constantly balance protection against competing requirements. Sometimes the balance works out. Sometimes, as with the SDKFZ 222, the balance fails catastrophically and soldiers pay the price. German planners made a calculated gamble in the mid-1930s that didn't pay off. They believed speed and agility would compensate for limited protection. They assumed reconnaissance vehicles would maintain safe distances, watching rather than engaging. They underestimated how frequently light armored cars would find themselves under fire from rifles at close range. The fluid, chaotic reality of World War II combat, particularly across the vast Russian steppes and open desert terrain, meant that textbook doctrine about reconnaissance units maintaining distance rarely matched what actually happened. Intelligence reports compiled by British analysts in 1943 and distributed throughout Commonwealth forces meticulously documented every weakness. The documents listed exact armor thickness measurements at different locations, identified precise aim points for various weapons, and recommended specific tactical approaches. Tank crews received information explaining they could penetrate the vehicles using coaxial machine guns at short distances. Anti-tank gun crews were told to avoid wasting precious armor-piercing ammunition on reconnaissance cars since high explosive rounds would suffice and were more abundant. Infantry received particularly comprehensive guidance. Those reports reminded soldiers that their rifles, so frequently dismissed as useless against armored vehicles, could become lethal weapons when loaded with armor-piercing ammunition. Recommended engagement distances, optimal angles for impacts, and the value of concentrated firepower were all detailed. British training incorporated this knowledge, ensuring soldiers understood they weren't helpless against German vehicles and possessed effective defensive measures. The vulnerability extended far beyond mere armor thickness. The open-topped turret, while enabling excellent visibility, exposed the crew to overhead threats. Hand grenades, mortar fragments, and artillery airbursts could wound or kill crew members even without penetrating the hull. Wire mesh screens over the turret opening provided limited protection against directly thrown grenades, but couldn't stop fragmentation from nearby explosions. The confined interior created a deadly environment. 3 crew members packed into space barely larger than a modern compact car meant a single armor-piercing round penetrating the crew compartment could cause multiple casualties. Spalling, where metal fragments tore away from the armor's interior upon impact even without complete penetration, created razor-sharp projectiles ricocheting inside the confined space. The limited ammunition and fuel storage created additional vulnerabilities. The vehicle could only carry restricted quantities of 20mm cannon rounds and machine gun ammunition. Once expended during prolonged firefights, the vehicle had only small arms for defense. The fuel tanks, despite their protection by thin armor, could ignite when incendiary ammunition or tracer rounds penetrated the hull. The tires, though puncture-resistant by the standards of the era, remained vulnerable to gunfire. A vehicle immobilized by tire damage became a stationary target, eliminating its primary survival advantage of speed. Crews facing tire damage had to either abandon their vehicle or attempt repairs under fire. Neither option proved appealing when facing enemy infantry equipped with armor-piercing ammunition. German crews, demonstrating considerable courage, continued performing reconnaissance missions with whatever vehicles they received, including the vulnerable SDKFZ 222s. Many showed extraordinary bravery, understanding or suspecting their protection was inadequate, but executing orders regardless. Reconnaissance represents inherently dangerous work, requiring soldiers to probe enemy lines, gather intelligence, and frequently sacrifice themselves, providing commanders the information needed for larger operations. The SDKFZ 222 served throughout the war across multiple theaters, despite its acknowledged vulnerabilities, because Germany possessed insufficient replacement vehicles to retire the entire fleet. Production priorities favored tanks, assault guns, and other combat vehicles considered more critical for defensive operations. Reconnaissance vehicles, while important, received lower priority as German industry struggled replacing catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front and countering Allied bombing campaigns. Several SDKFZ 222 examples survive in museums today, preserved as historical artifacts representing German military technology from the late 1930s and early 1940s. The Weald Foundation maintains an actual SDKFZ 222 AUSFA specimen. The Bovington Tank Museum, the Australian War Memorial, and various other institutions possess examples captured during the war. The vehicle at the American Heritage Museum was captured during North African operations in 1943 and shipped to England for evaluation at Chertsey. Modern visitors examining these preserved vehicles can see the thin armor plates directly, instantly understanding why Allied soldiers found them vulnerable once they engaged them with armor-piercing ammunition. Running hands over the 8mm side plates, visitors develop visceral comprehension of just how minimal the protection actually was. The angular design and sloped surfaces, appearing impressive in propaganda photographs, reveal surprisingly thin metal when examined closely. The SDKFZ 222 represents a cautionary tale in military vehicle design, illustrating what happens when designers misjudge the protection-mobility balance. It demonstrates how vehicles optimized for early war conditions become obsolete as weapons technology advances and enemies adapt tactics. It shows how drawing board decisions made during peacetime have lethal consequences for soldiers years later, when vehicles encounter combat conditions their designers never anticipated. The story also highlights the importance of battlefield intelligence and cooperation between allied nations. Rapid distribution of knowledge about vehicle vulnerabilities across British, Commonwealth, Soviet, and American forces meant Allied infantry worldwide understood they possessed effective countermeasures. This intelligence sharing prevented unnecessary casualties and increased soldier confidence when encountering German reconnaissance units. From a broader historical perspective, the SDKFZ 222 exemplifies the technological and industrial competition defining World War II. Every nation struggled balancing competing demands for protection, mobility, firepower, reliability, and cost. Every design represented compromises privileging some characteristics while accepting weaknesses elsewhere. The SDKFZ 222's particular compromises worked well during early war years, but failed as the conflict evolved and opponents adapted. The vehicle's history continues informing modern military vehicle design. Current light armored vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles face similar challenges, balancing protection against mobility and cost. Modern materials like composite armor and ceramic plates offer superior protection at lower weight than the rolled homogeneous steel of World War II. Yet the fundamental tension remains. Every kilogram added for protection reduces mobility and increases fuel consumption. The SDKFZ 222 also reminds us of the human cost of technological failure. Behind every penetrated armor plate was a crew member trusting their nation's engineers and military leadership had provided adequate protection. German soldiers climbed into these vehicles, believing their equipment would keep them alive. The discovery that this trust was misplaced, that ordinary rifle fire could defeat their armor, must have been terrifying. When British soldiers behind desert lines discovered that rifles loaded with armor-piercing ammunition penetrated the German armored car, they had uncovered one of the vehicle's lesser-known fatal flaws. It wasn't a war-winning revelation that changed strategic situations. The SDKFZ 222 was reconnaissance equipment, not a tank. Its presence or absence didn't alter strategic calculations. But for individual soldiers facing these vehicles, knowing their rifles were effective weapons rather than useless against armor meant everything. It meant they could fight back. It meant they weren't helpless. The 8 mm of steel that German engineers believed would provide sufficient protection proved barely adequate against the lightest weapons and completely inadequate against armor-piercing rifle ammunition. Steel tested in controlled conditions and approved through military bureaucracy failed catastrophically when confronted with combat realities where bullets arrived from unexpected angles at close range. German crews paid for that engineering mistake with their lives. The vulnerability spread through Allied forces, and the SDKFZ 222, once feared for its speed and firepower, became simply another vulnerable target. Not invincible, not particularly difficult to defeat. Just a vehicle with thin armor that infantry weapons could penetrate when loaded with appropriate ammunition. The protective coating had been stripped away, and every Allied soldier learned to see through the imposing angular exterior to the vulnerable reality underneath.